Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're going to be continuing on with the series I've been doing so far with the cold cases. And today's story, the one that I found out, it sort of ties them all together. So the person they believe that was responsible for this murder, they believe were responsible, and they linked it to the stories that we've already previously covered. So Penny Bell, Alison Shaughnessy, and a couple of other people. There was links to another girl that I'm going to be covering in the future, and there was even talks at one point about it possibly being Robert Napper who was responsible for the murder of Rachel Nichol in a park in 1992. Obviously, that didn't get solved until around 16 years later in 2008. So today I'm going to be talking about the murder of Jean Bradley. Now, obviously, you guys know that I like to sort of go back from the start. I like to know who the victim was, but as always, there's always sometimes a block comes up on some of the sources that I try and investigate. And with this one particularly, I could not find any information on who Jean was as a person. All I do know is that she was born around 1945, 1946. As an adult, she lived in Crowthorne in Berkshire, and she was in a long-term relationship with a man called Nicholas Osborne, who worked as a teacher. Now, Jean, growing up, she was part of a business that she became a specialist, in helping businesses move to bigger and better locations to maximise their profits. She done this from an office in New Bond Street, so this is around 30 miles from her home in Berkshire. So to commute to this to her business, she found the best way to do this was to drive to Acton Town train station, and she would park up on a little side road and then take the rest of the journey by the tube. So she would find a little tiny spot in Carberry Avenue, and this was really close to the station, like a couple of minutes walk. And she just basically done this every single day that she went to work. And this was no different on the morning of the Thursday, the 25th of March in 1993. So she goes to work, parks up, goes to work, gets a tube there, and she finishes her usual time around 5 or 6 in the evening. She then takes the train from Green Park to Acton Town station, and she arrives at Acton Town at 7:20. And she then makes her way back to her car. She stops off at an off licence to pick up a few cans of drinks. And one resident recalled her seeing her in Gullensby Gardens, and this was on the way to walk into her car, but they reported that they didn't see anyone else in the vicinity or anyone else that was close to Jean. So as Jean, she arrives at her car, she takes off her bag, puts her bag on the back seat, puts her bag of shopping on the back seat with it, and she was attacked by a random strange man. And this attack was actually witnessed by a carpenter who was driving his van down the road, and on the opposite side of the road was a woman driving with her son. And Jean's loud screaming, it alerted the neighbours. So obviously we're talking about 7 o'clock at night, everyone's going to be up, people in their homes probably just sitting down watching TV. And the woman in the car, she began following this man, and she said that he was basically just walking down the road casually, taking long strides, but didn't seem to be running. The carpenter, who also witnessed, so he pulls up and he gets out of his van and actually begins following this man. And he confronts the man, who then threatens him with the same knife. And he said that the carpenter said that the knife was held in a black plastic bag. And this man was basically threatening him, saying that you will get it, you're going to get it as well, I'll have you. And he described this attacker as quite tall. He had a gaunt face with quite drawn in cheeks, and he had at least 2 days worth of stubble on his face. He was said to have been in his late 30s, early 40s, very slim built, and he really bizarrely was said to have made a sou'wester hat. I made one himself. If you're not sure what a sou'wester hat is, I'm going to post a picture up here. But it's basically the little yellow plasticky looking hat that fishermen wear. But he seemed to have fashioned one out of black bin liners. And this was struck as really, really unusual, because this particular evening it was described as quite warm and really, really dry. And despite the knife threats, the carpenter kept chase. Obviously, the attacker, he began moving away from the scene at a considerable pace. The carpenter just followed him and eventually lost track of him. So he continues looking, but meanwhile, back at the scene, Jean was actually attended to by passers-by. People would come out of their home to help, and paramedics arrived on the scene to try and save her. Sadly, Jean ended up passing away from her injuries. They attempted to revive her, but this come to no avail. It had been determined that she had been stabbed at least 8 times, and the knife used was said to have been an 8-inch carving or butcher knife. And it was shown that Jean really, really fought for her life. Like, she fought back hard. She had defensive cuts to her hands and her arms, and one of them was quite deep, so it was determined that she at one point had tried to grab the knife and obviously got the blade. So the carpenter, meanwhile, he caught up with this attacker, like the murderer, and they kept the pursuit through Gullensby Lane and onto Boller Lane, followed onto Boller Bridge Road and onto a South Acton estate. And the carpenter saw the attacker bypass a shortcut over some railings and followed them onto Church Road. And this is when they come up to a pub that was on the corner. The pub was called the Prince of Wales. And unfortunately, due to crowds, he eventually lost sight of the attacker, so continued looking but was unable to re-find him. Now, quite close by was a tower block, and in this tower block a man was on his balcony, and as he's looking down he could see someone acting really suspicious hiding in a doorway. So this was on a road called Ragley Close, and the man said that this guy that was acting suspicious removed his hat, and it showed dark brown or black hair, and he was wearing 3/4 length cream parka. He said that this man appeared to be quite flat-footed, and the witness said it looked as if the attacker was looking for the best route to make another getaway. And this murderer, he was seen walking up to Buckland Walk towards Acton High Street, and this was around 1.5 miles from where he had attacked Jean. Now, as always and as they do, Jean's attack and Jean's murder, it made the front page news the following day. And this is mainly due to the chase that the carpenter had given, and just basically because of the nature of the attack. You know, as we all know, and as I've frequently mentioned on this channel, you are more likely to be attacked by someone you know, be murdered by someone you know, other rather than obviously a complete stranger. But this was a complete stranger that happened to do this, and comparisons were made to the deaths of Penny, Rachel Nichol and Alison Shaughnessy. So obviously these happened a couple of years before, or a year before. As I already said at the beginning of the video, police were trying to make links because those murders today still remain unsolved, or two of them do at least. But very, very quickly, as soon as they made those links, they couldn't find any other links to help with the case. And obviously no motive could be found. Like, why was Jean just randomly attacked? Nothing had been stolen. Her bag was still in the back seat with the cans in her shopping bag. She had not been sexually assaulted in any way. And it was initially thought to be a robbery gone wrong. But like I said, obviously her bag and everything, all her belongings, were still in the car. So the murderer, they then fit a small profile about the murderer, and they said that he was described as a strange character, probably noticed by psychiatric doctors or support workers who are people with addiction issues. So an appeal was then put out in the April edition of Crime Watch UK, and they basically appealed directly to psychiatrists and support workers. But it took a while for anyone to come forward, and it was suggested that the clothes he was seen wearing had been purchased from charity shops. It was revealed that other witnesses were yet to come forward, and the biggest piece of evidence found at the scene was a piece of the bag that was used to conceal the weapon. And this piece happened to have a logo on it, and the logo said Narcissus. I think I'm pronouncing that right. If someone wants to correct me down below, please do, but I believe that's how it's pronounced. And this was along with the words extruded, printed, and in the United, and there was small gaps in between these words, with the words filling those gaps. They were said to have not been deciphered. So this bag was then traced to a manufacturer based in Ayrshire, and it was established that it had been used by a health food shop, and this was based in Fleet Street. So the detectives go to Fleet Street to go to this shop, and they talk to whoever the manufacturers, and they discover that the bag is no longer in print. It's a discontinued thing at that point. So the detectives then added that they wanted to speak to a street vendor who had been on Carberry Road on the 25th of March, and he had been seen knocking door to door, and he was described to be quite a young boy in his early 20s. So he wasn't deemed as a suspect, he wasn't deemed as a suspect that they were looking for, but they felt that he could hold some vital information to help with the cause. And a £20,000 reward was then put out for any information, and even a mobile police station was placed on Ragley Close, and obviously this was the last place that the murderer had been seen, had been spotted. So due to the carpenter's description, police were sure that they would actually find this man, and they said that he must have had general knowledge of the area due to the route of the chase. And eventually more witnesses did come forward to say that they had seen a man behaving really, really suspicious on that night in Acton, and he was even seen on trains around West London. And all of these descriptions matched, but they matched the DNA profile, the identity of the person they were looking for, but this basically led to nothing. Like, he seems that he had just completely vanished into thin air. Nothing more was then come forward, no more further information was come forward until around 5 months later. So on the 28th of August 1993, police arrested a 39-year-old man called Francis Marnell. He was living in a B&B at the time in Norfolk, and they charged him with Jean's murder. Now, one thing I did find out was that during the investigation around the March-April time, there was an identity parade. Frank was, as he prefers to be known rather than Francis, he was put into this identity parade, and he was positively ID'd by the carpenter. So he's then arrested and actually charged with Jean's murder. And this was then featured on an update on the September 1993 Crime Watch, where it's said to have been 2 locals who had actually brought the police's attention to Francis. So Frank, he preferred to be known as Frank, as I said, and he had a history of mental health issues and drug abuse, and he was actually regularly treated in hospitals for psychosis. And at the time of his arrest, he, like I said, was living in a B&B, and when questioned, he denied any responsibility of murdering Jean. But then further down the line, he actually said that there's a strong possibility that he could have done it, but he couldn't remember if he had or not. He was also at one point voluntarily called the police to say that he had been in the area when Jean had been murdered, and he told officers that he had been waiting at Acton Station for a girlfriend. So Frank was then re-put into the identity parade, and the carpenter again was brought in, and he again gave a positive ID of Frank. I mean, obviously at some point during the chase on the night that Jean died, this carpenter was face to face with this person, so he positively ID'd Frank for the second time. He even stood up and testified in court. The minute I walked through the door, he caught my eye. So that was from the carpenter himself. With another eyewitness, she also said that he recognised Frank, and a third said that they were 98% sure that he was the person that done this. And it was said that viewers of Crime Watch had called police to say that he fit the description given by the witnesses, and so that meant all other suspects at this point, they were all eliminated. So with obviously the positive IDs in mind, police believe that they've got the right man for Jean's murder, and the case goes to court. So at a magistrate's hearing on the 11th of November 1993, things take a complete 360. And it's determined that because of the evidence, or lack of evidence, it wasn't a strong enough cause to actually charge him, and he was eventually cleared of any charges relating to Jean. And the other witnesses who hadn't got as close as the carpenter had picked out other individuals in the ID parades, and 2 friends of Frank's came forward and gave him an alibi. They said that he had been with them on the night that Jean had been murdered. Didn't really give any other plausible story as to what they were doing. They just said that they were together on that night. And a police spokesperson said that this result came as a shock and we are disappointed. And lead detective Bob Fenton said, Nothing shocks me in the criminal justice system. The CPS had reportedly been aware of the alibi beforehand, and even with this in mind, they still went ahead with the charges, indicating they disregarded the alibis. And after the case had collapsed, detectives announced that they would be liaising with the CPS on the next steps. So after Frank had been released, the producer of Crime Watch, he then wrote a letter of complaint to the Guardian newspaper about the coverage of the crime. And he said that the paper had falsely claimed that Frank had been named as a suspect, and this was just basically down to him bearing a strong resemblance to the actor who portrayed him in the, well, portrayed the killer, sorry, in the reconstruction. And he also highlighted the fact that some of the witnesses had failed to pick Frank out in the ID parade. The carpenter, he just basically stuck to his story. He was adamant that this was Frank. Like, Frank was the one that had killed Jean. And eventually, Jean's case, sadly, like obviously as we've been discussing in the past few weeks, the case went cold. And this was until the cold case investigation section was formed in 2000. So obviously I mentioned that in the Alison Shaughnessy video. And the Independent newspaper, they also released an article the same year stating that the Met had the worst case of clear-up rate for murder in the UK. So with that coming out in a newspaper, I mean, obviously we all know what newspapers are like. They print out what they want to print out to sell the story, but 9 times out of 10 it doesn't tend to be the whole truth. So it could be the fact that they're probably making it up. It could be based in reality, but the last thing that the Met Police want is any negativity around their work. So they were probably seen to need to be doing something, and this is why they set up the cold case revision. And work basically went on to solve Jean's murder. They really tried, but unfortunately they couldn't come across any new leads. And they worked for the next few years, and as I mentioned earlier in the video, they at one point thought about Robert Napper being this person. So when the police come across this sort of line of inquiry, as they solved the Rachel Nichol murder, the case of Jean was brought to the attention once more in 2008. So Robert was convicted for the murder of Rachel Nichol at that point. I think I previously spoke about it in another video, if I remember rightly. If I didn't, so basically Rachel was a young woman who was in a park with her son, and Robert stabbed her in front of her little boy. The little boy was only about 2 at the time, and the case went unsolved for about 16 years. So they then re-look into Jean's murder. They can't find any positive link to Robert. They also try and look into him possibly being the ones or the murderer of Claire Tiltman, who was another young girl in 1993. It's one that I'm going to be covering very, very soon, so keep a lookout for that one. And also they looked into possibly him being the one that killed Penny Bell. He was proven to have not killed Claire, but the lack of evidence basically continued. They couldn't find anything to link him to Penny or Jean, and again the case went cold. they've continued looking, and every now and then, like, coverage of Jean's case will come up, even around this year. So obviously we're talking 2024. As of 2024, though, the case of Jean Bradley still remains unsolved. So that brings us to the end of today's video. I do really apologise. Obviously, it is only a 25-minute video. I could only talk about the information I could find. I am going to continue for the next couple of weeks on the cold case revisions. Obviously, I've got some exciting stuff going on in my personal life coming up, so for a while these may be quite shorter videos than what we're used to, but don't worry, I will be going back towards working on 45-minute long videos to an hour. I really appreciate the time, guys. Please like, share and subscribe. If you have any other information about this case, if you know a bit more, if you'll find a bit more than what I could find, please feel free to comment down below. If you aren't subscribed and you just come across this video, please think about hitting the subscription bell. It doesn't cost a thing. I will never ask you guys for any money, but the subscription is always free. I do post every Friday, or I aim to post every Friday. But as always, your support really means the world to me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week for the next true crime story with Silhouette. Stay safe, and I'll see you soon.